I just recently uploaded a video recitation by the author Pai, who wrote the book on skillful means. And in that, he makes the point that in the 16th chapter of the Lotus Sutra, when the Buddha reveals the immeasurable length of his life, that it would be misconstrued if that were to be taken as equivalent to a theistic kind of concept of an eternal God. Well, one of the commentators on my channel quite a long time ago actually gigged me for using the term, quote, blessed one, in the context of my recitation of the Lankavatara Sutra. And he argued that the word Bhagavan means God. And of course, Bhagavan is one of the terms, one of the epitaphs, if you will, of the Buddha. So anyhow, I'll give my response relative to this question of whether when we talk about or make reference to Buddha, that it's equivalent of talking about an entity that we can refer to as God. And then I'll make a few more comments about my thoughts in this regard. I said to him, I am, of course, reciting this sutra unabridged. And of course, what I'm referring to there is my recitation of the Lankavatara Sutra. As to your preferred language, namely use of the word God, I think we have had this conversation before, my friend. I have no problem with you using the word God, but you are no doubt aware that you are an outlier among Buddhists in this respect. And I'll explain more why I think it's not totally inappropriate to use the term in the context of Buddhism. I don't recall seeing that appellation used in any Buddhist translation, and I certainly haven't, although in my recent work regarding the recitation of the Prajnaparamita Sutra in 8,000 lines, the term Lord is used consistently and repeatedly when the Buddha speaks. The Lord said, or the Lord asked, whatever, okay? And we can quibble about semantics in terms of whether Lord means God. Further, I said, I think most present-day Buddhists would consider the name God as having a decidedly Christian connotation, and thus to be avoided. And, I think that, frankly, particularly in the West, a lot of the folks who are attracted to Buddhism and gravitate toward it, in some ways are reacting against the more mainstream religious kind of tradition in the West, which is clearly Christianity. So to use the word God, which is commonly used within Christianity, kind of rubs people the wrong way in terms of how they want to perceive Buddhism and how they want to see a distinction between Buddhism and the Christian tradition. That said, I told him, living here in the Bible Belt of the United States, which is in North Carolina, which is smack dab in the middle of the Bible Belt, I have often used the phrase Buddha or God in the context of local discussions to be respectful of those with Christian beliefs. Because at the level of what we would think of in Shin Buddhism maybe as the ordinary person, I don't know that, the ordinary the ordinary Christian believer and the ordinary Shin Buddhist believer, when the Buddhist talks about Amida and when the Christian talks about God, I'm not sure in their own mind and heart they're really thinking about a different kind of entity. They probably are construing this entity in probably dualistic terms, even though fundamentally, as Pai points out, and as clearly the Mahayana tradition articulates, is that within Buddhism, we don't view Buddha as, strictly speaking, totally separate from ourselves, totally independent and separate from the rest of the cosmos, if you will. So again, I've used this term locally if it helps communicate, because Buddhism, the Buddha Sakyamuni, for example, it's all about communication. It's all about trying to get to get messages across to people that will help them to and if you will attain Shinjin, or trusting, to be comforted in the idea that they're embraced by this cosmic entity, by this divine power, never to be abandoned. So again, I've often used the phrase Buddha or God in the context of local discussions to be respectful of those with Christian beliefs. Another reason I do that is that I agree with you in many respects about the overlap in the meaning of the titles. And again, I think some of those overlaps have to do with the impulse within human beings to experience a sense of deep humility, a deep sense of personal limitations and fault, and to have a tendency to want to rely upon other power. And I think in the AA creed, the 12-step program, I think they talk about God in whatever way you think of him, for example. So how important are the titles or the names as compared to the meanings that underlie those names in terms of how the believer perceives and conceives and experiences other power or the divinity? And that may be consistent too with the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, where again the meanings are innumerable, that by which we can refer to some of these spiritual dynamics. But I said to him, two big differences, however, in my understanding of Buddhism, I said, with which you may or may not agree, are that, and these are the two things. It relates to the question, why am I a Buddhist? You know, if there's overlap, and if I'm in a Christian environment, you know, why did I gravitate toward Mahayana Buddhism or Buddhism in general? And in the context of my spiritual awakening, if you will, my conversion experience, I wasn't attached to any particular religion, even though I did grow up in a household that affiliated or identified with the Episcopalian faith, and I sang in the choir and became baptized and confirmed and all that good stuff. But as I went to college, I never really had that as a core part of what was important to me. But then again, at a certain point in time, as I've described in other videos, I did have this sort of turning about, if you want to think of it in terms of the description in the Lankavatara. And at that point, it was like I didn't have any particular identification with a particular tradition. And so really I had the opportunity to say, well, which tradition makes most sense to me? Okay. I didn't know it at the time, but I think you could argue, or the way I would think of it now, is I was being drawn by Amida. But that's kind of another story. The point is, what are the aspects of the Christian belief system associated with the concept of God that I think differs from Buddhism and that I have more trouble with? Number one, most Buddhists, myself included, don't see Buddha as the creator, okay? We don't see, and this is very much, I think, a concept within Christianity, is that God created the world, created everything, created humans, etc. And I just don't see Buddha taking on that particular role in the course of the history of the cosmos, if you will. Most of the Judeo-Christian, and I may be wrong about this, but I think most of the Judeo-Christian kinds of traditions who talk about God view him, and they all typically view it as a him as opposed to a her, view him as creator. And to my mind, and feel free to comment below if you think I'm wrong-headed on this, that I haven't read anything or developed any sense of an understanding of Buddhism that we think Buddha created everything. Number two, and this is critical, is that we don't truly see him, and I'll again put him in quotes as I did here, as separate from ourselves in a dualistic sense, even though we may prefer to reflect on him as a personal savior on a day-to-day basis. So again, the thinking mind is dualistic. By definition, we have to have some kind of worldview. We have to have some way of thinking of ourselves. And by definition, when we think of ourselves, we're thinking of ourselves as a separate being, even though we know from our study of Buddhism and our reflection and our meditation and our trying to get in touch with prajna is that that's an illusion or ignorance, one of the three poisons. But nevertheless, as an ordinary being, that's who I am, and I can't escape on a day-to-day basis having that sense of being separate, having limitations, having faults, experiencing a sense of entrustment and embracement by an other power who I think of and view as a Mira Buddha within the context of the story of Dharma-kara and the 18th vow. And so, again, but I'm aware at another level, and this I love about Mahayana Buddhism and the sutras, particularly the Prajnaparamita literature, is that that is an illusion in the sense that fundamentally we're not separate from God, if you will. And some mystical Christian traditions appreciate this when they can talk about God being within, the spirit being within. And again, I'm no expert on Christian theology, but the mystical traditions of all great religious systems do have a common experience, I think, which Aldous Huxley, for example, calls the perennial philosophy. I'll mention a third that I didn't mention to my friend. And this is a real, if you excuse the term, bugaboo, is that Christians, I think, in some sense, believe, or at least some do, that God is in control, that God is not only omniscient, but omnipotent. And that presents some real problems in terms of, then why suffering? Why all the terrible things that happen in the world in terms of wars, torture, killing, whatever. And there are rationales for this that are given within the theological treatises of Christianity, I'm sure, but it's a stumbling block for me, and it's inconsistent with how I view Buddha. I think Buddha's agenda, if you will, is teaching. He wants to teach us. He does know us. So there's a certain omniscience. And in the Avatamsaka Sutra, they talk about omniscience as an ultimate outcome for the bodhisattva that perseveres in his or her attainments until the stage of Buddhahood or Tathagatahood. So there's a certain omniscience in the sense the Buddha knows us, and that's why he or she tailors the teaching to our particular personalities, our needs as human beings, as an individual human being. But as far as being able to control, no, I think that the earlier forms of Buddhism certainly talk about causes and conditions. They talk about karma, and these are consistent with a more scientific approach as to why whatever is happening right now is happening as related to all the things that happened prior to it. So that approach, again, is one that just makes more sense to me. So I'll add that third. So anyhow, I ended my little response to my friend to say, in any case, I suppose we can go back to what Suzuki said, which I guess as I referenced here, that I recited in my video on the second section of his introduction to the Lanka. That is, Suzuki said, "One Buddha with many names. Peace." I said to him, peace. So we find the name of this divine entity, whatever we want to think of it as. And again, I would come back also to the Trikaya doctrine of the Dharmakaya and the Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya, whatever we want to call that Sambhogakaya level Buddha or God. The name, all religions seem to really focus in on the name. And of course, in Shin Buddhism, we focus in on the name too. The name is Namo Mira Butsu, Namo Mira Butsu. And that contains in a nutshell the saving power, the power associated with the 18th vow, the primal vow. And that's why I adhere to that sole focus for my own practice which is really a non-practice in terms of anything I can attain based on my own self-power. Namo Mita Butch. Namo Mita Butch. Namo Mita